Welcome everyone to our ZNCC call, where we're very excited to hear from Sara Bronin, who is the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And so just to give you a lay of the conversation, we're going to start with doing her presentation. And then at the end of her presentation, there'll be time for Q&A, and then we'll also get into some updates from the various organizations that are listed on the screen. So before I turn it over to Chair Bronin, I'm going to go ahead and read you her bio. So if you're not familiar with who she is, which hopefully you are, you'll just have a little bit more context for who she is. And so Sara Bronin was confirmed by unanimous consent by the United States Senate in December 2022 to serve as the 12th chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. A Mexican American, she is the first person of color to serve in this position. Chair Bronin is currently on leave from her tenured position at Cornell University, where she serves as professor in the College of Art, Architecture, and Planning, a professor of the Rubacha Department of Real Estate, an associate faculty member of the Law School, and a member of the graduate faculty in the field of architecture. Chair Bronin received a JD from Yale Law School, an M.Sc in Economic and Social History from the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and also received a B.Arch and B.A. in the Plan 2 Liberal Arts Honors Program from the University of Texas at Austin. And so we are so thrilled to have her here to talk more about the program. And so with that, Chair Bronin, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nikita. And I'm going to steal your screen sharing if that is okay.
Sure.
And I am going to just do this because it's a little easier sometimes for folks who are visual, like I'm sure many on this call, to kind of see what I'm talking about, maybe in words. So I'm really appreciative to be here today. I see many of the names on this call and, know many of you by reputation, some of you directly, and just really thrilled about your leadership in bringing this issue to the fore, and also really trying to hone in on and engage on the key policy questions that at the state, local, and federal, and even international levels. So your work is really valuable, and I really appreciate being asked to talk with you today. So I think I'm going to give a short presentation and then just talk through, what the program comment might mean. So I'm going to provide background in a few respects: what our agency is, what kinds of things we do, why this proposal is relevant to your work, reviewing the program comment itself, and I'm going to focus in on the activities that are covered, and then just kind of point you into the direction of inviting feedback. So I don't know if folks have heard of the Advisory Council before, but it is, I think, a pretty consequential federal agency that very few people know exists. And just by way of background, who we are, 9 federal agencies and the architect of the Capitol are 10 of the 24 members of the council. We have 8 public and expert members appointed by the president. These are individuals, so it's the 4 and 4 situation. The full-time chair, which is me, is the only full-time member of the agency, and just recently had to go, the legislation was changed, so that person now goes through the Senate confirmation process, or I did. My predecessor did. There's only been 2 of us so far. And my hope is that as the full-time chair, I'm trying to, really advance, elevate the agency in terms of what it should be doing, and to make it a more prominent part of national conversations about key issues, including about building reuse. Governor, mayor, and tribal member, those are also presidentially appointed. Our governor is the governor of Delaware, our mayor is the mayor of Birmingham, and our tribal member is Amelia Marchand, based in Hawaii. And we have 3 organizations. So these 3 organizations are named by Congress, named in our statute as being 3 of the 24 members. And they represent what you might call traditional preservation interests. So the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers and their state counterparts, those 2 are both part of our federal preservation regime, and I could talk about that in a minute, as well as the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So all of those members are the council, and I would say we have 2 main functions. The first is overseeing the Section 106 review process, And the reason why I started with this agency is really important. No one's heard of us. One of the things that we do is we regulate how federal agencies can go about 120,000 federal agency actions annually. We call these undertakings. I have a definition of this in a couple of slides, but the scope of our review process is really large. It's actually 10 times more actions than are covered by NEPA, just to give you a sense of scale, because our process covers anything an agency does, not just major federal actions, which NEPA covers. So for those familiar with that statute as a point of reference. We advise the president, Congress, and state and local governments on preservation policy. We do that in a few ways, and I'll talk about one that's relevant to this in a moment. But first, I wanted to talk about the regulatory process that we use. We call it Section 106. So Section 106 refers to this provision in the National Historic Preservation Act that requires federal agencies to take into account the effect of their actions on historic properties. So some things have really obvious effects on historic properties, like you're going to build a highway, federal agency, highway construction expansion almost always has, if not building demolition, might have tribal or archaeological resources impacted and so on. So when those types of resources are affected or could be affected, the federal agency goes through this step-by-step 106 process to evaluate those effects. But our process also touches any project receiving federal funding. Now, this is really important. I probably put this slide in the wrong place, but just given the volume of activity on energy efficiency, net zero, zero net carbon buildings, and so on, the volume of the federal investment in private projects is one of the reasons why we have to think about, as an agency, how to treat those projects and those investments. A program comment. So you might say, what is a program comment? I don't know why we called it that, but we called it that in our regulations. It tailors the Section 106 process for a group of undertakings or a program affecting historic properties. We've only done about 18 program comments over the course of the agency's existence. It's been around since 1966. So these are pretty rare, and they're usually pretty limited. They're limited to one agency or one type of building or set of buildings. So again, just to recap on these terms, undertakings are those projects that are directly undertaken by an agency, like a courthouse or a GSA building, or they are projects that are funded, licensed, permitted, or otherwise approved by an agency. When it comes to historic properties, lots of you work in the historic property space, but our statute only applies to properties on or eligible for the National Register. So they've met those criteria. They have to be significant. They have to have integrity. So that's our regulatory process. Now I want to talk about one aspect of our advisings. That's the other function that we do, which is most relevant to what we're talking about today, which is our policy statement on climate change and historic preservation. So that's available on our website. It covers planning for, mitigating, and adapting to and researching climate change issues. It has about 15 principles, about a dozen pages, and it goes through sort of what is the ideal for a federal agency and what is the ideal historic preservation policy across all of these different aspects. So one of the ones I wanted to call to your attention is this policy principle number 6. For example, it says government should encourage the thoughtful retrofit of older and historic buildings to improve operational energy efficiency. So this is like, these are the things that we should do as a federal government or at the state and local federal level. That's what that provision says. Policy principle 8 also says that this is especially important for disadvantaged groups. And there is another policy statement we adopted last year on housing and historic preservation that also has a whole bunch of, we should really do these things type of principles. And I'll just point you to policy principle 5. In addition to provisions on energy efficiency in the climate policy statement, there are provisions on clean energy and the need to integrate clean energy into our work, and to make sure that in the Section 106 process, these types of projects are being prioritized. So here's a slide I said might be out of order, which is there is so much being invested right now by the federal government in energy efficiency, thanks to President Biden, Congress, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That will lead to a really unprecedented number of Section 106 reviews. And if we don't get ahead of those projects that are already coming down the pike and give federal agencies clear rules about how to treat them, we're not going to be able to keep up with the volume of investment that needs to be deployed across all our buildings, but particularly our historic buildings. As you all know, a huge amount of greenhouse gas emission comes from our buildings, and 20% specifically comes from heating, cooling, and operating housing. Okay, so the rationale for the program comment, it advances the principles of the ACHP policy statement on climate change, the one I just mentioned. That's part of our advising. Hey, we really should do this. We also believe it will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to historic building use, and it will reduce operational costs, which will overall make it easier and more logical for us to actually reuse buildings, because from a cost standpoint, will make more sense. Overall, we want to advance historic preservation goals while doing three things. So there are three parts of the program comment. One part is about expanding access to housing. Another part is most relevant to this group, potentially facilitating climate resilient and zero emissions buildings. And the third part is to promote climate friendly transportation. Finally, just a word on the scope. So this program comment is different from other program comments that we've done before because it applies, or it is drafted. And by the way, this is just a proposal, and so we're soliciting comment on it. It is drafted to apply to all federal agencies and all programs. So when it comes to housing, you know, HUD has a huge housing stock, 1 million units. The Department of Defense, similarly, 1 million units of housing. And not only do other agencies operate housing, particularly for their workers, but they also contribute billions of dollars to public and private housing units. HUD alone has billions in the Community Development Block Grant Program that goes to state and local governments that supports housing. Every dollar of that Community Development Block Grant Program is covered by this. From a buildings perspective, they're not just the specific provisions we have on housing buildings, but they're also the general buildings provisions that relate to this climate smart buildings goal. All federal buildings, all federally funded upgrades of private buildings, all are encompassed in are all swept into our Section 106 review process and are all intended to be covered by this program comment. And then finally, a climate friendly transportation, which is a third of the document, covers really alternatives to cars. So pedestrian, bike, micro mobility, and public transit projects across all federal agencies and programs. So that was a lot on background. I'm going to talk now about the program comment. And I'm going to give you the overview of all three parts. I'll just really skim the housing and Appendix A and C, and we could talk most about Appendix B. But that the appendices are really where we list all of the undertakings that agencies can do without further review in the first part. So there's an A1 and A2. So I don't know, Nikita, if you have a link to drop in the chat in case folks missed it. But just so you can follow along, there's a part 1 and part 2 of each appendix. The part 1 of the appendix are all those undertakings that a federal agency can do without further historic preservation review. So we identify those undertakings and also the types of things, types of places, for example, that the undertakings might occur on a building, or a scope of, let's say, a dig related item like a tree planting. Appendix B talks about climate smart buildings, and Appendix C covers climate friendly transportation. Again, each of these appendices has 2 parts. Oh, sorry, the second part has those undertakings that can be done with certain conditions, exclusions, or requirements. So as for Appendix A, it's broken up into site work, building exterior, building interior, emergency work, and other activities. So the site work includes things that might happen in and around the site. Building exterior work happens in the building envelope or on the top of the building, and building interior is the stuff that happens in a building. For the housing program comment, just to kind of start the conversation on site work, it says that lots of things can happen in and around the site, including replacements of playgrounds, sidewalks, fencing, lighting, and so on, as long as those items are less than 45 years old and as long as it's not in previously disturbed ground. And there are lots of other provisions too about planting trees and landscaping and maintenance and so on. And you would think like, well, why should this go through Section 106 review at all? And in many cases, we've heard from public housing authorities that they're confused about what triggers Section 106 review. That's why it's been really important for us to really run through that list of activities. From an exterior perspective, we've talked about the kinds of things that on the exterior are unlikely to have adverse effects, but that that agencies do as a matter of course frequently. And so an example of those would be things like door, window, roofing, mechanical systems, and solar energy installations and replacements. Appendix A1 talks about those things not happening on the primary facade of a historic building, but Appendix A2 talks about what happens when those can be, how those can be installed actually visible from the street, and has a couple of provisions on that. On the inside, we've said that interior walls and ceilings are really fair game as long as they're not in what preservations call primary spaces. We define that to include lobbies, ceremonial rooms, maybe first floor corridors, or other spaces that are identified as being historic and part of the character defining features of the historic building. So moving on to climate smart buildings. This is a building in downtown Chicago. I think a couple of you might be familiar with it. It's the General Services Administration owned building in the heart of downtown that was proposed for demolition. And at the last minute it was saved thanks to our process, but now it's like, what are you going to do with this building? And we hope it becomes actually a highly energy efficient and super powered building. Maybe we can get to a net zero building, I'm not sure. But this program comment aims to make sure that buildings like that can be rehabbed as efficiently as possible. So Appendix B covers site work, the exterior of the building, the interior of the building. It also exempts activities like energy audits, feasibility studies, things that we know need to be done, and sometimes are thought to have to go through a 106 review process. This part, and I'm happy to, for folks who want to open and dig into the details of Appendix B, we talk about site work like green infrastructure, stormwater management. We talk about the replacement of utilities. We talk about, I just got off a call earlier with a group of preservation commissioners, and they said, well, what about this windows thing? And, you know, the position that the program comment takes is that it's great to have historic windows and we love them. I've restored my own historic windows in houses I've had, but for the program comment, we allow for storm windows, allow for replacement windows not on primary facades for energy efficiency purposes. And again, also have a provision talking about the federal agency determining with a qualified professional whether something might have an adverse effect. Clean energy technologies, typically solar, also covered in that appendix. The part 1, B1, it covers those solar panels that are not on primary facades, but part B2 provides a fast track for solar panels that are on primary facades. And what that requires is a review by what we call a qualified professional. And then finally, the last part, there's a whole bunch of building systems, mechanical systems, insulation, lighting systems, building control systems that are listed out in a massive list in the interior section. The program comment takes a position that all of these things should be allowed to be installed in historic buildings, but it just in general, but especially if they don't have any impact on the facade. And then just to run through the transportation appendix, there's a lot there on installing ADA compliant ramps, crosswalks, vegetation, maintenance, landscapes, green infrastructure, again, electric vehicle charging stations, Other fixtures and equipment that make the pedestrian realm more appealing. Bike lanes, a lot of stuff on bike lanes. And so examples include bulb outs, ramps, crosswalks, replacement of pavement for cool and permeable pavement, the installation of bike infrastructure. I am big into bike infrastructure, and this program comment, maybe it goes overboard, I don't know, but it's really permissive when it comes to parking, bike parking and micromobility parking racks, flex posts. My position is these things can be easily removed. And in fact, by allowing that kind of infrastructure to be built, you're promoting exactly the kind of transportation modes that most complement historic districts. Things like benches, planters, tables, lights, bus shelters, small bus shelters are also approved, are also proposed to be approved to go through as a right. And as well, pedestrian and transit bridges, which we know have caused a lot of conversation, but by and large have no adverse effects. Not covered activities include activities touching our most important historic sites, national landmarks, national monuments, national historic parks. Tribal lands are not covered unless the tribe actually allows it to be covered, and so that's something that they can proactively opt into, but it's not a requirement that they accept the program comment. It does not allow for demolition of buildings by any means. That was one misconception that we can clear up. So just some summary thoughts. What the program comment aims to do is to identify those undertakings that can go through without further review, that will reduce costs from an administrative standpoint for federal agencies, as well as for the private parties that are receiving federal funding. The program comment also hopes to have consistency across project types. That means that somebody in state X is not treated differently than someone in state Y. And we also hope that clear rules will help us deploy all of these investments much more efficiently and effectively. So that's all I wanted to say today in terms of a presentation, because I think your discussion would be very much appreciated. We do have an email address where we would love for you to send feedback, and we're hoping for that feedback by October 9th. You can keep track of us on our social media or through me. I always repost everything related to the program comment. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and just see if folks have questions or comments.